the hidden legal battles behind the cameras. For years, the Duggar family were TLC's golden empire. Their show 19 Kids and Counting became a ratings juggernaut, selling America on an image of traditional values, squeaky, clean morals.
My inches are where it counts.
And a family so large that every episode felt like a circus. To millions of viewers, the Duggars were entertainment. To TLC, they were profit. And to the family themselves, they were a brand. But behind the cameras, behind the staged smiles and picture-perfect family dinners, a very different story was unfolding. It's a story TLC never wanted you to hear: the lawsuits, scandals, and allegations that dragged the Duggars into courtrooms and headlines. And while the network carefully edited episodes to protect their stars, legal documents painted a picture of dysfunction, negligence, and deliberate silence. The Duggar lawsuits are not simply about legal filings. They are about power. They are about the lengths a network will go to preserve its golden goose. And they are about the dark reality of what happens when a family's private failings collide with the public machine of reality television. The Josh Duggar shadow. The most infamous of these lawsuits orbit around one person: Josh Duggar, the eldest son. To the outside world, Josh was the wholesome big brother. In early seasons, TLC often portrayed him as the dutiful son stepping into adulthood, marrying Anna, starting his own family. But court filings, leaked police reports, and later lawsuits revealed another reality, one of abuse, cover-ups, and systemic silence. The first major shock came in 2015, when a bombshell report revealed that Josh had molested several of his younger sisters years earlier. The disturbing details came not from tabloids, but from police records. According to reports, the incidents had been known to Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar, the patriarch and matriarch of the family, but were dealt with privately and quietly, shielding Josh from consequences. The fallout was seismic. 19 Kids and Counting was pulled from TLC. Advertisers abandoned ship. Lawsuits soon followed. Some of Josh's sisters filed suits alleging that police had violated their privacy by releasing the reports. Others targeted the way local officials and the media handled the information. But at the heart of it, every legal battle circled around the same painful truth: the Duggar family had secrets, and those secrets were now public. TLC's calculated silence. But where does TLC fit into this? That's the uncomfortable part. Because while lawsuits directly named officials and institutions, the network itself was walking a tightrope. TLC had built its empire on the Duggars. They had profited for years from their image. And when the scandals broke, they faced a dilemma: cut ties completely or salvage the brand. What TLC did next was telling. Instead of fully distancing from the Duggars, the network quietly rebranded. 19 Kids and Counting was canceled, yes, but within months, a spin-off was born: Counting On. The new show placed the spotlight on the Duggar daughters, marketing them as resilient survivors building new lives. TLC carefully edited the narrative, presenting the sisters as wholesome yet independent, while cutting Josh out entirely. Behind the scenes, however, legal documents show that lawsuits involving Josh and the family were still active. Court cases about the molestation reports, about privacy violations, about financial dealings. All of it painted a picture that clashed with the family-friendly image TLC was still selling. The network's silence was strategic. By not addressing lawsuits publicly, they preserved their profits. Viewers who didn't follow the news could still tune in, believing the Duggar saga was intact. But the lawsuits were real, and they revealed a darker truth. TLC knew its stars were entangled in legal chaos, but continued to broadcast sanitized versions of their lives. Civil lawsuits and Duggar defenses. As the years went on, lawsuits multiplied. Some were directly connected to Josh's actions. Others focused on broader family and financial disputes. The sisters, who sued over the release of the molestation records, argued that their privacy had been violated in one of the most humiliating ways possible. Details of abuse they endured as children became public fodder. These were not simply legal skirmishes. They were traumatic battles fought in courtrooms and tabloids simultaneously. The Duggar family's legal strategy was consistent: deny wrongdoing, shift blame, and protect the brand. Jim Bob and Michelle often framed the family as victims of media persecution, while their lawyers fought to minimize damages. But the documents tell another story. Depositions revealed knowledge of abuse, questionable responses to authorities, and efforts to maintain secrecy rather than accountability. For TLC, this was a nightmare. Every new filing threatened to expose more details. Every lawsuit risked dragging the network into the conversation. And yet, they persisted in airing Counting On, insisting it was about the future, not the past. To critics, it looked like corporate whitewashing monetizing trauma while ignoring the lawsuits unfolding in real time. The 2021 Josh Duggar trial. The climax came in 2021, when Josh Duggar faced federal charges for possessing child sexual abuse material. This was no longer a civil lawsuit. This was a criminal trial of national attention. The courtroom evidence was damning. Digital forensics traced illegal downloads to Josh's devices. Prosecutors painted a chilling portrait of a man leading a double life. For TLC, the trial was the breaking point. Just days before Josh's conviction, the network announced it was canceling Counting On for good. The lawsuits, scandals, and criminal proceedings had finally overwhelmed the brand. But notice the timing. TLC only severed ties when it was unavoidable, when the public fallout became too large to contain. Behind the polished press release about respecting the privacy of the family, one truth lingered: TLC had profited off the Duggars for more than a decade, even as lawsuits and scandals swirled. They only walked away when forced by headlines, not by conscience. What TLC didn't show you. So, what is it that TLC didn't want you to know? It's not just the lawsuits themselves. It's how those lawsuits reveal the machinery of reality television. The family you watched on TV was simultaneously fighting legal battles that contradicted the wholesome image. Those sisters suing over their own abuse were still being filmed as smiling, marketable stars. That every lawsuit was another crack in the Duggar empire, yet TLC kept cashing in. That accountability only came when lawsuits turned into criminal trials and silence was no longer an option. These legal cases expose a system where profit came before ethics, where image was prioritized over justice, and where the truth was carefully edited out of the narrative. The beginning of the end. What was marketed as wholesome family entertainment was in reality a tangled web of legal documents, courtroom testimonies, and scandalous revelations. And while viewers tuned in to see weddings, births, and family gatherings, the unspoken reality was that lawyers, judges, and victims were fighting parallel battles in the background. The Duggar lawsuits are more than gossip. They are a case study in how media corporations protect profit at the expense of truth. And they remind us that behind every polished reality show lies a reality far more complicated, far more painful, and far more human than the cameras ever reveal. TLC's crisis mode, profits over principles. When the first Duggar lawsuits and police report leaks came to light, TLC had a decision to make. The network could either cut ties with the family completely, admit to viewers that they had invested in a brand collapsing under the weight of scandal, or they could protect their business model, repackage the story, and hope the audience kept watching. They chose the latter. What followed wasn't just public relations. It was a calculated strategy of damage control, one that revealed just how far a network would go to preserve its golden goose. Because to TLC, the Duggars weren't just a family. They were a franchise. And a franchise doesn't get abandoned, it gets rebranded. The immediate fallout. After the 2015 revelations about Josh Duggar's molestation history, TLC faced intense pressure. Advertisers dropped out, viewers flooded social media with outrage, politicians, advocacy groups, and media outlets demanded accountability. On the surface, TLC appeared to act decisively. They canceled 19 kids and counting. The press releases framed it as a moral stand, a decision to respect the victims and acknowledge the seriousness of the revelations. To casual viewers, it seemed like closure. The Duggars were finished. But inside TLC's boardrooms, the thinking was different. The Duggar brand still had value. The daughters were marketable. The weddings, pregnancies, and new storylines could still pull in millions of viewers. And so, behind the scenes, the network plotted a way to continue profiting while distancing itself from Josh. The birth of Counting On. Within months, a new show premiered, Counting On. Instead of focusing on Jim Bob and Michelle and their 19 children as a whole, the spin-off spotlighted the older Duggar daughters, Jill, Jessa, Ginger, and Joy, narrated as resilient young women building their own lives. The move was subtle but brilliant from a corporate standpoint. It allowed TLC to claim they had moved on from the scandal, while keeping their pipeline of Duggar content flowing. Weddings, baby announcements, and wholesome family drama kept the show alive, even as lawsuits swirled in the background. What TLC didn't say was that the very sisters being marketed as reality TV stars were also plaintiffs in lawsuits about the molestation case. They were suing over privacy violations, fighting to be recognized as victims. And yet, simultaneously, they were still filmed for entertainment. The contradiction was glaring. How could a network claim to respect survivors while also turning those same survivors into content for ratings? The answer was simple. TLC wasn't prioritizing justice, they were prioritizing business. Strategic editing, what viewers weren't shown. TLC's damage control didn't stop at rebranding. It extended into the editing room. Episodes of Counting On carefully avoided direct discussion of Josh, the lawsuits, or the legal mess behind the scenes. Instead, storylines focused on weddings, courtships, and quirky Duggar traditions. Any mention of trauma was filtered through vague language about hard times or moving forward. This wasn't just storytelling. It was corporate strategy: control the narrative, erase controversy, and keep viewers emotionally invested. By sanitizing the content, TLC ensured that casual audiences never saw the darker reality: the lawsuits, the depositions, the court filings where the Duggar sisters detailed their suffering. The result was a split reality. In courtrooms, the Duggars were entangled in legal battles exposing decades of secrecy. On TLC, they were still America's favorite conservative family, smiling through another family dinner. Lawsuits in the shadows. During the height of Counting On, multiple lawsuits involving the family were active. Josh's sisters, Jill, Jessa Duggar, and Joy, sued city officials over the release of the molestation reports, arguing that their privacy had been violated. Court documents included painful details of how the girls learned their most private traumas had been leaked to the public. Meanwhile, civil suits tied to Josh's actions, including fraud allegations and later federal criminal charges, cast a long shadow. These legal battles were reported in the news, but never once acknowledged on the TLC airwaves. This silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. TLC's corporate lawyers and PR teams knew that acknowledging lawsuits could expose the network to liability or public backlash, so the lawsuits were ignored as though they didn't exist, despite being central to the Duggar story. Corporate hypocrisy. What makes this strategy so striking is the hypocrisy at its core. TLC marketed Counting On as a story of resilience, a tribute to young women overcoming adversity. But they never told viewers the full truth of that adversity. The lawsuits showed that the Duggar daughters were not just characters in a feel-good narrative. They were victims who had endured abuse, humiliation, and the violation of their privacy. Their lawsuits weren't side stories, they were the central reality of their lives. By omitting these truths, TLC commodified trauma while pretending to celebrate healing. It was damage control masquerading as empowerment, the business behind the ethics. Why did TLC take this route? The answer lies in the cold math of television. 19 Kids and Counting was one of TLC's most lucrative shows, drawing millions of viewers per episode and generating huge advertising revenue. Canceling it entirely would have meant throwing away years of branding, audience loyalty, and merchandising. By launching Counting On, TLC preserved that revenue stream while appearing to take the high road. It was a business decision first, an ethical decision second, and it reflected a larger truth about reality television. Networks will protect their profits long before they protect their stars or their audiences. When damage control failed, for a while, TLC's strategy worked. Counting On ran for 6 years, drawing steady viewership. But as lawsuits multiplied and Josh Duggar's 2021 criminal trial made headlines worldwide, the facade crumbled. No amount of careful editing could hide the reality. The Duggar brand was too tainted to continue. TLC finally canceled Counting On, citing the need to respect the family's privacy. But again, the timing revealed the truth. The network only acted when the scandal became unmanageable. In other words, TLC didn't cancel the Duggars because of morality. They canceled them because their damage control strategy could no longer control the damage. What TLC's strategy reveals. Point 2 of this story is not just about the lawsuits themselves. It's about how a billion-dollar network responded to them. They rebranded instead of reckoning. They edited instead of confronting. They commodified survivors instead of protecting them. And they only walked away when their strategy collapsed under public pressure. This is what TLC doesn't want you to know. The network's loyalty was never to truth, justice, or ethics. It was always to profit. And every step of their damage control strategy reflected that reality. The bigger picture. The Duggar lawsuits matter not only because of what happened in courtrooms, but because they expose how corporate media functions. Networks like TLC sell us stories, not realities. They shape narratives to protect their investments, even if that means silencing victims and ignoring lawsuits. The Duggars were a case study in this practice. They were profitable until they weren't. And when lawsuits made them unprofitable, TLC cut them loose, not a moment sooner. That is the true story of TLC's damage control, a story of spin, silence, and corporate strategy, all designed to hide the truth. from the very viewers who made the Duggars famous. The silent victims step forward. When the world first learned about Josh Duggar's abusive behavior, the spotlight immediately turned to the victims. But what many viewers didn't realize at the time was that some of those victims were the very sisters America had come to know through 19 Kids and counting. Jill, Jessa, Jinger, and Joy Anna, the Duggar daughters who had smiled through countless TLC episodes, were suddenly thrust into a nightmare. Not only had their childhood traumas been exposed to the public through leaked police records, but they also had to fight for recognition and justice in a system stacked against them. The Duggar sisters' lawsuits weren't just legal documents. They were cries for accountability, for dignity, and for independence from the family machine that had controlled their lives. And they revealed, perhaps more clearly than anything else, the clash between the wholesome image TLC sold and the painful reality behind the scenes, the privacy lawsuit. In 2017, 4 of the Duggar sisters filed a lawsuit against city, county, and law enforcement officials, as well as certain media outlets, over the release of the police reports documenting Josh's molestation of his younger siblings. Their claim was simple yet devastating. Their most intimate, painful experiences as minors were made public in violation of their privacy rights. The sisters argued that the release of those records caused them humiliation, emotional distress, and lifelong damage. To understand their anger, consider this: the sisters had been abused as children, but instead of being protected, their suffering became tabloid fodder. Their names, faces, and stories were splashed across the internet, not because they chose to speak, but because the system failed them. The lawsuit was about more than money. It was about reclaiming dignity in the face of exposure. It was about sending a message that victims should never be treated as collateral damage in the rush to report a scandal. The family divide, but the lawsuits revealed something else too: cracks within the Duggar family itself. Jim, Bob, and Michelle, the patriarch and matriarch, had spent years managing their family's image. They controlled storylines, signed contracts with TLC, and framed themselves as protectors of traditional values. But when their daughters stepped forward with lawsuits, the image of unity fractured. Reports suggested tension between Jill and Jim Bob in particular. Jill began to distance herself from the family, publicly speaking about boundaries, therapy, and her struggles with control behind the scenes. She and her husband, Derek Dillard, became vocal about the financial and emotional toll of growing up in the Duggar machine. For TLC, this was dangerous. The very stars they marketed as wholesome young women were now plaintiffs, openly challenging authority figures both in their family and in institutions. The lawsuits weren't just legal actions, they were acts of independence. A courtroom battle for dignity. Inside the courtroom, the Duggar sisters faced an uphill battle. Defense attorneys argued that the release of the police reports had followed legal procedure. Officials claimed they had redacted names and acted in good faith. Media outlets argued that the story was newsworthy, but the sisters pushed back. They described the pain of having their trauma exposed without consent. They spoke of feeling betrayed, not only by Josh, but by the adults and institutions who should have protected them. Legal battles dragged on for years. Some claims were dismissed, others moved forward. In the end, the outcomes were mixed, but the lawsuits achieved something important. They shattered the illusion that the Duggar family was untouchable. They proved that even reality TV's perfect family could be forced to confront its failures in court. And more importantly, they gave the sisters their voices back. For once, they weren't just characters on a TLC episode. They were survivors demanding to be heard. TLC's editing choices. What did TLC do during all of this? As usual, the network stayed silent. On Counting On, the sisters were portrayed as moving forward, building families, and finding love. Rarely, if ever, did the show touch on the lawsuits. There was no mention of the courtroom filings, the emotional testimonies, or the betrayal they felt. Instead, TLC continued to monetize their weddings and pregnancies as though the lawsuits were happening in an alternate universe. This was deliberate. To acknowledge the lawsuits would have meant acknowledging TLC's role in platforming a family whose secrets were tearing it apart. So they chose erasure, letting viewers see only smiles, while the sisters fought for justice off-screen. Jill Duggar's independence. Among the sisters, Jill became the most outspoken. In interviews and later in her memoir, she revealed the extent of her struggles, therapy sessions, strained family relationships, and the realization that her life had been shaped more by contracts and cameras than by her own choices. Her lawsuit was not just about privacy, it was about freedom. Jill spoke openly about feeling controlled by her father and manipulated by the TLC brand. By stepping away from the show and pursuing legal action, she carved a path of independence, even as it created painful rifts with her family. For many viewers, Jill's courage symbolized a shift. The Duggars were no longer just a family brand. They were individuals breaking free from a system of silence. Why the lawsuits mattered? The Duggar sisters' lawsuits matter for two reasons. First, they exposed how institutions, from law enforcement to media companies, can fail victims of abuse. By releasing those police reports, officials turned survivors into public spectacles. The lawsuits forced a reckoning with privacy laws and victims' rights, setting a precedent that abuse survivors must be protected, even when their cases involve public figures. Second, the lawsuits marked the moment the Duggar daughters stopped being passive characters in a TLC franchise and became active voices in their own stories. They reclaimed agency, not just from the legal system, but from their family and the network that had profited off them for years. This fight for justice was messy, painful, and imperfect, but it was real, and it revealed a truth TLC never wanted viewers to see, that behind the smiling daughters in pastel dresses were survivors demanding to be heard on their own terms. The uncomfortable truth for TLC. For TLC, the sisters' lawsuits created a nightmare. How could they continue selling the image of a perfect family when the stars themselves were suing over abuse and betrayal? The network's answer, once again, was silence. But silence speaks volumes. By refusing to address the lawsuits, TLC made its priorities clear. Ratings mattered more than reality. Profits mattered more than protecting survivors. And the carefully edited episodes of Counting On became less about documenting reality and more about hiding it. Survivors, not characters. Point 3 of this story is clear: the Duggar sisters' lawsuits were a battle for dignity and independence in the face of silence and exploitation. They forced the world to see them not as props in a family brand, but as survivors of trauma. They exposed the failings of institutions that leaked their stories. They challenged the authority of their parents and the network that commodified their lives. And in doing so, they revealed the truth TLC wanted to hide. The Duggars were not just reality TV stars. They were a family fractured by secrets, lawsuits, and pain.